Chapter 10 of Sulla the Fortunate, The Great Dictator by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Sulla Comes Home. 1. Sulla left Ephesus early in the year, and after a passage of 3 days, landed at Piraeus. He spent a little time in Athens, which he could not expect to revisit. He was initiated into the mysteries, then still a privilege not to be despised, even if it no longer possessed its former importance. And he acquired the library of Apellicon the Teian, which contained the unique revised copies of Aristotle's works. This was an achievement of some significance in the history of literature. From the versions which Sulla then obtained sprang all the later complete editions of Aristotle. The strain of the last few years was telling upon him. At Athens, he was attacked by the first symptoms of gout. He was in no hurry and went to Idepsus in Euboea to take a course of the hot waters and a rest cure. For a while he put aside all business and, quote, amused himself with actors, unquote. No record remains of the dramatic pieces he selected for his entertainment. On the beach at Idepsus, he was humbly presented with 2 magnificent fish by some native fishermen. He was delighted and inquired their town. They were men of Haliae in Boeotia. He had a long memory for some things. Haliae was one of the towns he had broken up and dispersed after the Battle of Orchomenos for disaffection. So there were men of Haliae still remaining. The trembling fishermen admitted it. Sulla dryly bade them cheer up and go in peace, as they had engaged the services of no insignificant intercessors. On the strength of this, the former inhabitants of Haliae felt that they had authority to reassemble and refound their city. At length he took the road again, and marching through Thessaly and Macedonia, crossed the mountains to Dyrrachium. The populares were now showing the curious paralysis which before had marked the Senate, and probably for the same reason. The influence of the great financiers was against them. Not only was Dyrrachium open to Sulla, but Brundusium, which stood to it as Dover to Calais, was not reliably held. The omens at first were unfavorable. At Apollonia, not far from Dyrrachium, a satyr was caught, alleged to be exactly like the satyrs depicted by painters and sculptors. It was brought before Sulla and questioned through several interpreters. But whatever or whoever the uncouth object might be, it or he could speak no known language and answered only by noises, quote, something between the neighing of a horse and the bleating of a goat, unquote. Sulla, in consternation, ordered the disastrous object to be destroyed. Whether it were the satyr or the general situation of affairs, Sulla felt that every possible step should be taken to assist fortune. He had about 40,000 men, all old and trained soldiers, entirely devoted to him. But to invade Italy was very different from invading Asia. Among the peculiar virtues of Sulla was a thorough understanding that political conditions are more important than military and are precedent to the latter. He never fell into the superficial error of supposing that military operations could create or destroy the circumstances that are formed by public opinion and the subtle forces which unite or dissever men. He knew that political considerations could melt armies or bank up against him powers with which he could never hope to struggle. As Hannibal dissolved the Alps with vinegar, Sulla prepared his way by dissolving political opinion in Italy. It was his aim to convince the Italians and the mass of ordinary men that they had nothing to fear from him. He issued a promise of unconditional amnesty to all who severed their connection with the revolutionary government. and he solemnly undertook to confirm and protect the new Italian citizens in their hard-won franchise. Every man in his army severally made oath not to take his discharge, as was his right in strict law, on entering Italy, not voluntarily to do any injury to Italy, to maintain the Italian franchise, and to recognize Italian citizens as friends and equals. The army, of its own accord, offered to lodge bonds of good behavior with its commander, each man depositing a certain sum of money which could be forfeited in the event of desertion or misconduct. Sulla thanked his men warmly, but refused this practical mark of loyalty. He was satisfied with their word. The omens were now favorable. He transported his army over to Brundusium in 1,200 vessels, and the great port opened her gates to him. All Apulia, the heel of Italy, and, in this case, her Achilles' heel, came into his hands without a blow being struck. Sulla was, in the sight of all human prudence, gambling with fortune, but his throw of the dice was firm and decisive, and, as usual, the lucky throw came up. From Brundusium he took the Appian road by Tarentum and Venusia, crossed the corner of Samnium, and entered Campania once more. At Capua, for the first time, he came into contact with the enemy. The army of the consul Gaius Norbanus was at Capua. That of the other consul, Lucius Scipio, was on the way from Rome and had not yet arrived. This was indeed fortune. Sulla attacked Norbanus at once, crushed him, and blockaded the remnant of his army in Capua and Neapolis. There must have been a fatal lack of central direction in the strategy of the populares. Besides the direct military injury, the defeat of Norbanus damaged their prestige beyond repair and set free all the waiting disaffection which only needed reassurance in order to reveal itself. 2. The weakness of some kinds of policy was at this point illustrated by the accessions which came to him. All the proscriptions of Marius had failed to wipe out certain crucial persons who were destined to play important parts in the future. Failed for the simple reason that it was impossible even to identify them. Young Marcus Licinius Crassus joined Sulla probably at Dyrrhachium, and promptly upon the victory at Capua, Strabo's son, Gnaeus Pompeius, a young man as charming and popular as his father had been hateful and hated, came down from Picenum with strong reinforcements. Gaius Julius Caesar, a youth of 19, with oiled hair and fashionable clothes, the nephew of Gaius Marius and the son-in-law of Cinna, was in Rome and stayed there. Sulla had returned to an Italy where the first triumvirate that later on ushered in the empire was already on the threshold of manhood. Crassus fought and Pompeius fought. Caesar merely looked on. Like Sulla, he could bide his time. Everyone who came into contact with Pompeius fell under his spell. He had not only great physical beauty, but first-rate ability, and, to crown all, he had a perfectly genuine humility and unselfishness which carried away the ordinary sensual man. Sulla, like everyone else, had disliked and distrusted Strabo. Pompeius, as everyone else did, he loved. The news had already arrived that Pompeius had raised a small army in Picenum, massed Carbo from the military road that gave access to Sulla's flank, and securely organized the district. He came in person to report and join up. When they met, and Sulla dismounted, to find 3 whole legions and the vision of Pompeius, the wise man of the world returned their formal greeting of Imperator by the same glorious name, that dream, ambition, and envy of all Romans. Indeed, here at last was his ideal, the perfect aristocrat. It was as if fortune had greeted his return to Italy by granting him the sight of the human embodiment of all he wanted. And Pompeius was faultless. He blushed, was pleased, but did not take it seriously. There was hope for Rome. Many years later, his head was thrown at the feet of Julius Caesar, and even that man of steel and crystal recoiled from it, remembering what once it had been. But the perfect aristocrat had many a year of success and fame to come to him before that day. To Sulla, he became the pattern to point to when blunderers and fools went wrong. And if ever we ask ourselves what mysterious ideal it was which Sulla was pursuing through the labyrinth of war and statecraft, the best answer we can give is Pompeius. To Pompeius he invariably rose and uncovered. Of such noble material are the illusions of men sometimes made. 3. Sulla advanced rapidly northwards with his new reinforcements. Scipio had not got beyond Teanum. Sulla parleyed. Now, as before, he had no intention of wasting by the use of force the men whom he could gain by persuasion. Scipio listened to Sulla's proposals for negotiation and accommodation, which were precisely what all moderate men most wanted. Sulla was holding the door open, as he had all along held it. How long he could continue to hold it open, with his camp full of the refugees and their memories, was a different matter. But he was still holding it open, and he did not betray any man who passed through. The negotiations with Scipio were somewhat prolonged, and while they went on, the armies fraternized. By degrees, Scipio's legionaries began to go over to Sulla. Scipio, still unable to make up his mind, in alarm denounced the armistice. Sulla indignantly maintained that an agreement had actually been concluded. Whether it had been concluded or not, Scipio's army heard with profound disapproval that the consul had broken off a promising negotiation for peace. It went over to Sulla in a body. The consul, having, unlike Fimbria, a clear conscience, did not commit suicide. He held his ground and was arrested in his own tent by Sulla's order. He was removed in custody. Many commanders have won battles. Sulla's two bloodless victories over Fimbria and Scipio are his own peculiar glory. The desertion of Scipio's army brought the campaign to an end for that year. Sulla, who had led a forlorn hope over the sea from Dyrrhachium to Brundusium, was in possession of half Italy and safely entrenched in a position to renew the war upon favorable terms. 4. He made no secret of his intentions. Events were marching firmly under his hand, and he could feel them to be going well. The immediate effort of the popular leaders was to raise more troops. Yet what they really needed was leadership, not men. The moderate leaders had proved useless. The party chiefs accordingly came forward openly to take command. Gaius Marius the Younger, an adopted son of old Marius, and Gnaeus Papirius Carbo were elected consuls for the year, and at once set to work. Quintus Sertorius went into Etruria to raise fresh legions. Sulla was perfectly aware of all the steps they were taking, as can be seen by the plan of campaign he drew up for the new operations. 3 armies were to be organized. One was to advance northward from Picenum along the Adriatic towards Cisalpine Gaul, and Metellus Pius was to be its nominal commander. Sulla, however, wished Pompeius to have a practically equal standing with Metellus. Pompeius hesitated to accept such a post in view of the greater rank and age of his prospective colleague, so Sulla consulted Metellus, who at once, pleased at the consideration shown him by a young man, cordially agreed that Pompeius should come to him on the terms arranged, and personally wrote to invite him. Pompeius, therefore, started for Picenum. Crassus, a natural genius who could organize anything and had the good sense to leave purely military matters to his professional subordinates, was sent into central Italy. With native caution, he asked for an escort. Sulla answered, "I give you for escort your father, your brother, and your friends and kindred, whose unjust murder I am avenging." Crassus accepted the rebuke, and penetrating into the Marsian land eastward of Rome, raised there a force destined to play an important part in the coming struggle. When, therefore, the campaign opened, 2 of Sulla's 3 armies were commanded by the later colleagues of Julius Caesar in the famous First Triumvirate. Facts of this kind are important to remember. 5. During the struggle against Mithridates, Sulla had been playing a close, intricate game of war in which there were but few moves, and those, for the most part, short ones. Circumstances were now entirely changed, and with the change came an alteration in his methods. His 2 Italian campaigns were wars of long moves and rapid marches, a strategy boldly designed, depending much upon the accurate conjunction of widely separated armies. The campaign began by the advance of Metellus northward from Picenum along the great military road which skirted the eastern coast. The fleet accompanied him, and entering Ravenna, isolated on that side the important junction of Ariminum, whence the road turned in a northwesterly direction straight across Italy to Placentia on the Po. He sent Marcus Lucullus forward to seize Placentia. By this means, Metellus acquired a powerful position in Carbo's rear, where he could watch all the roads leading into or out of northern Italy. The task of Pompeius was to prevent this long and somewhat tenuous line from being cut by a blow from Carbo, for which purpose he advanced inland, joined up with Crassus, and drove Carbo's lieutenant into Spoletium. All these operations were not, by themselves, safe. If they had stood alone, there was every likelihood that Carbo's counterblow would bring down the frail scheme like a house of cards, after which Carbo would only need to wipe out the scattered Sullan forces in detail. Sulla had reserved for himself the movements which were to give meaning and strength to those of Metellus, Crassus, and Pompeius. His own advance on the western side of the peninsula was along the Via Latina, through the heart of that mountainous country which was the true homeland of Rome. Near Signia, some 30 miles from the city, he came into touch with the army of the younger Marius. With all the caution of his adoptive father, Marius retreated upon a favorable situation at Sacriportus and made ready for battle. The march was a difficult and dangerous one. The country is one of those in which all the advantage lies with the defending army. The rear guard of Marius held all the passes, and Sulla's veterans had to fight as well as march every foot of the way. To add to the difficulties, the weather was adverse. Storms of wind and rain overwhelmed the troops, and for once Sulla was in a hurry. He must have known how much depended on the speed and success of his movements. He was expressly anxious to fight that day, for he had had an important dream the night before, in which he thought he saw old Marius warning his son to beware of the morrow as a fatal day. He had already sent out orders for a concentration preparatory to an attack when his principal officers intervened. They pointed out the impossibility of executing his orders. The men were dead beat, and had of their own accord flung themselves upon the ground to get a little rest as soon as the march was halted. Sulla never flogged a willing horse, and, as always, he gave way, but it was with the most intense reluctance. Fortune had played false at the critical moment. But it was not fortune that had played false. The blame rested on human strength and endurance, which could not rouse themselves to accomplish the task Sulla had set them. Fortune came to the rescue. The actual course of events is variously told. Plutarch had two versions of the tale. One, probably that of Sulla himself, in which Marius made an attack in person. The other, that of Fenestella, in which it was asserted that Marius never ordered the attack, but, tired out, was snatching a little sleep at the time. In any case, the attack was made. The sullen legionaries were engaged in throwing up the earthwork, which, by strictest and most invariable command of the drill book, never failed to surround their camp at night. Caught unawares, they snatched up their weapons and fought. Discipline, training, and morale always tell in war, but they can never have told more than in the short sword fighting. Sulla's men, however dead beat, were sufficiently alive to forget their fatigue and to scatter the new recruits of Marius before them. One division of the consular army declined to engage. Marius, according to Fenestella, was awakened by the stream of fugitives which began to pour through his bivouac. He had only time to reach Praeneste. The gates were already shut, and he was drawn up to safety by a rope. It was indeed a fatal day for him. Sulla's dream had come true. The Battle of Sacriportus cleared the road north. While Marius sent urgent messages to the praetor, Lucius Brutus Damasippus, to evacuate Rome, leaving as few of the optimates behind him as he could, Sulla detached Quintus Ofella to blockade Praeneste and pushed on. Brutus carried out the orders sent him, and when Sulla at last arrived at Rome to snatch a glance at the old city, which he must often have wondered whether he would ever see again, it was to meet the maddening news of fresh massacre, Pelion heaped upon Ossa, in which even the noblest and most honored Roman of his day had perished. The murder of Quintus Mucius Scaevola was in its day as shocking and scandalous as that of Thomas Becket many centuries later. The old man took refuge in the Temple of Vesta, the holiest spot in Rome, where the ever-burning fire stood. The image of the goddess was drenched with his blood. His body was cast into the Tiber. He left behind him his great work on the civil law in 18 books, the basis from which all subsequent study of law took its start. Sulla would have been more than a soldier and a statesman. He would have been a saint, a spiritual degree of which he had never heard, if such a deed had not roused his emotions to fury. He was now the last of the group of optimates who had struggled to save the state from all that was overwhelming it. Rutilius was still in exile. Lucius Crassus had died, no one knew how. Drusus had been assassinated. Scaevola murdered on the altar. He himself had survived. How? By a series of miracles and chances, by fortune. He had no time to waste. He pushed on north. The three sullen armies were closing upon Carbo, who, at Clusium in Etruria, was held immobilized, unable effectively to deal his blow at Metellus while Sulla was coming up so rapidly. But Carbo was in a powerful position, and Sulla's advance came gradually to pause. The moment had arrived for fresh plans of campaign and for a regrouping of the various elements in the field. 6. The populares were making every effort to relieve young Marius in Praeneste, but thus far they had been prevented from doing so. The war began to center upon the fate of Praeneste. Into this condition of pause, the Samnites, who might have moved before, flung themselves with the object of bearing down the balance. A powerful force of Samnites and Lucanians, under the Samnite general Pontius Telesinus, set out for the relief of Praeneste. Picking up the garrison of Capua on its way, it swelled to a formidable striking force of 70,000 men, before which Sulla's detachments fell back. This serious news made it urgently necessary for Sulla to return southwards. As fortune would have it, he could go, for at this juncture his first plans matured of themselves. The proconsul Norbanus, carrying out what would, under more favorable circumstances, have been Carbo's counterstroke, had masked Marcus Lucullus in Placentia, advanced upon the main force of Metellus Pius, and been defeated. Lucullus, therefore, left Placentia and ventured a pitched battle at Fidentia. He had 16 cohorts against 50. While he was waiting for a favorable opening, the gale blew a quantity of flowers from the meadows nearby, till the troops were involuntarily decorated with them. With something of Sulla's own quickness at turning such incidents to account, Lucullus pointed out to his men that they were already crowned with the chaplets of victory. They accepted the half-jesting omen, joined battle, and were completely successful. The whole of Cisalpine Gaul fell into the hands of Metellus as the result. Carbo's powerful position was crumbling. Sulla accordingly felt free to return to Praeneste, which had become the chief point of danger. Sending word to Crassus to join him, he took post south of the city. Metellus was already on the march into Etruria, and Carbo threw up the game. He was never a man of strong nerves. He left secretly to take a ship for Africa. The remnants of his army either dispersed home or fell into the hands of Metellus. The Samnites had entered the war too late, so late that they were the only combatants left in the field, with 3 sullen armies to fight. One possible resource was left. They could destroy Rome and go down fighting. The city was but 1 day's march away. Pontius Telesinus consulted his Lucanian colleague, Lamponius, who was willing. The associated leaders of the Populares, Lucius Brutus Damasippus and Carinas, went with them. It was not only the Samnites who were prepared to die fighting. If the roof of the world were to be pulled in, the slippered ancients, the boys, the loafers of the slums, and the odds and ends who were all that, for the moment, were left in Rome, were equally ready to be present at the occasion. Pontius camped that night by the Colline Gate, having cleverly dodged Sulla by a forced night march. At daybreak, the slippered ancients made their heroic sally and were cut to pieces, as they probably expected to be by the Samnite fighting men. Complete and unutterable panic reigned in the city. The women, Plutarch says, behaving as if it were already sacked. But the delay had sufficed. Before Pontius could follow up his easy victory, there were horsemen on the horizon. Balbus and 700 of Sulla's troopers, the advance guard of Sulla himself, who was coming up fast and furious behind. Balbus and his men only waited to wipe the sweat off their horses and, rebridling, engaged the Samnites. Before noon, the foot sloggers were at hand, and Sulla with them. He halted them and ordered them to eat and drink, while cohort after cohort wheeled into place. Dolabella and Torquatus strongly counseled caution. They were not dealing with young Marius or Carbo, but with Samnites and Lucanians. Sulla refused to listen. His blood was up. It was 4 p.m. when the trumpets sounded and the battle was joined. 7. Dolabella and Torquatus, whether their counsel was expedient or not, were right in their estimate of the situation. The battle before the Colline Gate was fought with a ferocity and desperation very far from the standard of the popular armies. The left wing of the Sullans was at length broken after a sanguinary struggle, and Sulla rode to stop the rout. His white charger was recognized, and 2 Samnites simultaneously hurled javelins at him. Only the watchfulness of his servant, who touched the white horse forward, saved him, the javelins falling behind his horse's tail. He flung himself into the turmoil, entreating, threatening, catching hold of men with his hands, but not even Sulla could breast the stream of defeat. He was borne along in the crowd and carried, whether he would or no, to the camp, where a considerable part of the fugitives had taken refuge. Not only was the wing broken up, but even many of the non-combatants who had come out of the city to look on were involved and killed or trampled underfoot. In Rome, all was believed to be lost, and the siege of Praeneste was supposed to be raised. Many fugitives arrived at the headquarters of Ofella's investing army to assure him that Sulla was dead and Rome in the hands of the Samnites. Ofella, being out of the circle of excitement, must have thought this a rather unlikely tale, but the fugitives were certainly a fact, since they were before him. He did not raise the siege, but wisely waited for further information. The battle must have broken up and lost its ordered coherence after nightfall, but it can have been no happy night they spent, striving to patch up some order out of the shattered remains of the unbeaten Sullan legions, not knowing what fortune had in store. What Sulla thought of matters may be better guessed if the story of his prayer to Apollo be true. He had a little golden image of Apollo, bought from Delphi, which he always carried about with him in battle. He drew it out, kissed it, and said, "O Apollo Pythius, who in so many battles have raised to honor and greatness Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, will you now cast him down and bring him to the gate of his own city to perish shamefully with his fellow citizens?" And indeed, it must have looked very like that. But about midnight, messengers from Crassus arrived with a sobering and restoring inquiry whether Sulla had any supplies to spare. It then appeared that the right wing, which Crassus had commanded, had been entirely successful and had driven its opponents right off the field to Antemnae on the Tiber, north of Rome, outside which Crassus was waiting. Apparently fortune had not been quite so fickle as she appeared, and the absence of any pursuit was explained. Sulla reached Antemnae by dawn to see for himself how matters stood. A body of 3,000 of the enemy, whom Crassus had penned in, sent out a herald to ask for terms. Sulla granted them their lives on condition that they changed sides. They accepted these terms and joined in an attack on their late allies. We are not told to what section they belonged. They can hardly have been Samnites. The battle outside the Colline Gate, from first to last, lasted some 16 hours or so, from the afternoon of one day to the morning of the next. Like all battles with the Samnites, it was a savage, stand-up, knock-down fight, in which endurance counted for more than science. And as with all unscientific battles, it is hard to trace exactly where it ended and when or how. During all those 16 hours, the Temple of Fortune, which stood in the angle of the wall close to the Colline Gate, looked down upon the combatants. In the upshot, the miserable wreck of Sulla's magnificent army had 6,000 prisoners, including Pontius Telesinus, Brutus, and Carinus. Most of the rest of the Samnite fighters lay on the field. 8. This was the end. Sulla had come home. End of Chapter 10. Sulla Comes Home. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 11 of Sulla the Fortunate, the Great Dictator, by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Dictatorship of Sulla. 1. But to what home had he come? To a world in ruins, a state in chaos, a mankind corrupted by revolution, war, passion, folly, until, even if the bricks of old Rome had been saved from the deathless fury of the Samnite, the spiritual, the archetypal Rome, immortal in the heavens, the city of Camillus and of Manius Curius, might well seem to be dissolved. Sulla was in the position of one who builds afresh from the foundations. The old Rome had come to an end. if Rome continued, it would be a new Rome. And Sulla would have been not a modest man, but a fool if he had refused the task, for there was no one else who could undertake it. Two feelings were in his mind: a sardonic skepticism about his own private ability to accomplish the work before him, and an almost equally sardonic conviction that fortune would probably see him through. The events of the last 2 years of his life were woven in too complex a web to allow of being narrated wholly in order of time. We have to disentangle them into a different kind of order, and first we may take his official triumph. It was a memorably splendid function, distinguished by the royal spoils of Mithridates, for Sulla had conquered a king, while in the rear marched the exiles, crowned with garlands, hailing him as father and restorer. After the procession was over, Sulla delivered the formal official address, in which he reported his actions and justified the proceedings of his tenure of office. He deliberately belittled the part played by his own foresight and intelligence, and insisted throughout on the preponderant share of fortune, enumerating in detail the many hazards and the miraculous conjunctions of events which had brought him home. He finally requested to be granted the honorary title of Felix, the Fortunate. And if there had been, in the past, any considerable element of mere jest in his attitude towards fortune, there can have been very little now. The moment was almost the most solemn in the life of a Roman. The title he requested was the judgment he asked from mankind. 2. He had not come home merely to wreak vengeance on political foes, though, being human, he may have had no deep objection to the execution of people he disliked, and, being a pagan Roman in his moral training, vengeance was to him not a luxury, but a duty. But passion played so small a part in his life that the blind fury of hatred probably had little to do with his motives. He had come home, of course, to save himself, but, for the rest, to reestablish a principle and refound a state. He had not created the circumstances. They were given him, as a problem of chess is posited for solution. And in all that follows, we must strictly remember the factors of circumstance, which were not external, but internal conditions. Sulla did not live after 2,000 years of Christianity, nor even in an age of developed human science and philosophy. He went by such rules as a man may derive from obvious common sense and ordinary worldly experience. Even the main point of Plato's teaching, that obvious common sense may be hopelessly fallacious and ordinary worldly experience worthless, had not yet penetrated to the minds of men in Sulla's age. He unconsciously did as much as any man to drive home to mankind the practical importance of the Platonic standpoint, as will be clearer in the sequel. The problem he had to solve was to restore the mystical, the ideal Rome, the state of mind and temper, the moral tension which had constituted Roman greatness. The main process must lie in the recreation of such an aristocracy as that which had first created Rome. To do this, he had on the one hand to collect the remnants of the old aristocracy, and to bring forward elements which might be fitting to supplement them. On the other, he had to repress all adverse influences. The clearing of the stage came first in order, before the new actors could be introduced upon the scene. Here the call of political theory coincided with the demands of prudence. The populares themselves had made it extremely dangerous for Sulla to leave them alone, nor had they hitherto done anything to convince him that their genius was indispensable to the new Rome. They had borne their full share in creating that logic of events which is sometimes the blessing of men and sometimes their curse. For when great courses of action are once launched, they are as much out of control, even of the actors, as an avalanche is. and men may fight madly against the necessity which sweeps them on to actions they abhor. It is the peculiar distinction of Sulla that he was not a man who fought against the logic of events. With a dry lucidity, he carried out its dictates to the last letter. He was not mad in the sense in which old Marius had certainly been mad. There was no emotional frenzy in his mind. He was far too cynical to worry about injustice. The acuteness of his intelligence was, if anything, sharpened. He merely drove to its logical conclusion a process which other men had started, and to which there was no rational alternative in the field. It began with the slaughter of the prisoners taken in the battle at the Colline Gate. They had been rounded up into the Circus Flaminius, which stood in the Campus Martius, and 3 days after the battle they were massacred by Sulla's orders. He was addressing the Senate at the time in the Temple of Bellona, close to the Circus. Footnote: this temple, being technically outside the city, was the place where the Senate usually assembled to meet anyone who, like Sulla, until his triumph was over, could not legally enter the city precincts. Foreign envoys were received at the Temple of Bellona. End footnote. And the shrieks and cries startled the nerves of the august assembly. The calm logician paused in his remarks and reassured the nervous sentimentalists. It was, he observed acidly, merely the noise of a few offenders whose chastisement he had ordered. The senators did not accept his assurance with any kind of enthusiasm. Blood, always more blood. Where would it end? Sulla might have asked the equally cogent question, where did it begin? Since it was clear that Praeneste could never be relieved, young Marius and the leaders died by their own hands, and the town surrendered. 12,000 prisoners fell into the hands of Sulla. In accordance with his old promise, he dismissed all the ordinary citizens, both Roman and Praenestine, together with the women and children. The men of senatorial and official rank were detained. At first, he proceeded against them by the legal method of individual prosecution, but finding that this would take more time than anyone could spare, he anticipated the inevitable result by ordering them all to be executed. Praeneste was sacked. Capua also surrendered. Naples was taken by storm. Many towns held out for long periods. Volaterrae, for one, defied a siege of nearly 3 years, and then surrendered only on terms. But by that time, passions had run too high to be checked. Sulla's commander was slain by his own troops, and the garrison massacred as it marched out. 3. To do his work in the way he wanted, a legal office was necessary for Sulla. The power he possessed was, if it were anything, that of a proconsul in Asia, a very dubious official authority to exercise in Rome. One of the consuls for the year, the younger Marius, was dead. The other, Carbo, was in exile, and an interrex was in office. But Sulla did not want the consulship. Its powers were far too restricted. He needed something much greater, something at once legal and sufficiently wide in scope to accomplish his ends. He therefore proposed to the Senate the revival of the dictatorship. There was a touch of antiquarianism in the suggestion. For 120 years there had been no dictator. It was an office almost as obsolete as that of the Lord High Admiral in modern England. But the idea had two virtues. It was practical, and it went back to the days of aristocratic supremacy, when men had no such fear of dictators as the oligarchy had always shown. The Senate instructed the interrex, Lucius Valerius Flaccus, to draft a law. Sulla was to be a novel kind of dictator, technically rei publicae constituendi causa. and instead of holding the office for a certain limited time, 6 months was the period of the original office technically, re gerundae causa, it was to continue indefinitely with practically unlimited power, even the power to make new laws. The truth was that this office was not the dictatorship, but was an absolute monarchy in which Sulla held all the power that had once belonged to the kings. He had penetrated to one conception which was historically accurate, namely, the truth that, however much it may afterwards walk in independence, an aristocracy is, in its origin, the creation of a king. Armed with this new power, Sulla proceeded vigorously with the preliminary task of clearing the stage. He dispatched Pompeius to Sicily and Africa to recover those provinces and to resettle them, while he himself took the task of dealing with Italy. He declared that the very name of Samnium ought to be blotted out, and when he had finished with it, Samnium was the wilderness it has remained since that day. Here, too, Sulla acted with consistence. The Samnites had been a disruptive force. Their very virtues, however admirable of their kind, did not make for peace, security, or creativeness. They had always been ready to wreck Roman government in the interests of their own independence, and the only question was whether this unbending spirit of freedom was equally valuable to the world. No modern man dare answer such a question. He can only seek a way round the problem. For Sulla, the answer was clearly implicit in the principles he held. Believing, as he believed with his whole heart, in the necessity and expedience of Roman government, he did not hesitate at the logical conclusion. He did not hesitate when he faced the still more difficult problem of the elements in Rome itself, which had continually sought the destruction of Roman government. And here several rather curious factors entered into the matter. If Sulla had returned to a Rome which was in all respects normal, his logic might have taken a turn different from that which it did take. But he was standing in the midst of a catastrophic wreck, in which the public treasury and the private fortunes of his friends, not to speak of his own, had disappeared. Something of the former was recovered by the capture of Praeneste and the discovery of Carbo's war chest at Ariminum, but hardly sufficient to put the finances of the government on a stable basis. The majority of the refugees had no doubt been carried on the payroll of the Sullan army. 10 years of war, revolution, and confiscation were not likely to have left them much. Title deeds, even when they survive such storms, do not bring in money of themselves. If the treasury were to be refilled and compensation made to those who had suffered, some quite extraordinary measure must be resorted to. The measure which Sulla evolved was to all intents a capital levy on the wealthy men who had stood behind the revolution. There was no fiscal machinery by which such a levy could be carried out as part of the ordinary administration of government. A Roman, moreover, would have been even less likely than a modern man to endorse the principle of a capital levy. But presented to him in the shape of confiscation by the state of the property of political outlaws, it might pass muster. Again, it was neither possible nor worthwhile to split hairs over the scheme. To take a man's property is to take his life, and it would be a more defensible plan to make a clean job of the business and to wipe out all opportunity for conspiracy and revenge on the part of desperate men. Hence, all the circumstances of the case pointed to one conclusion: the punishment of the guilty, the removal of dangerous sources of future rebellion, the refilling of the treasury, and the compensation of the sufferers could all be made to follow from one act: the great proscription. which secured at the same time the removal of great amounts of wealth from hands which had misused it to others which would, at any rate in political theory, use it better. Sulla's intention created an alarm among some of his friends, which seems perhaps surprising if we do not realize that this capital levy was the core of the great proscription. Footnote. Mommsen refers to, quote, the indefiniteness of the proposed categories, unquote, as an explanation of this. The proscription was to include all civil and military officers who had acted for the revolution since the convention with Scipio, which Sulla still maintained had been formally concluded. There is nothing indefinite about this. We must look elsewhere for an explanation. And footnote. They were reconciled to it chiefly by the careful presentment of the plan as an act of vengeance. They could accept it in that dress, but that many of them realized that the vast confiscations which accompanied it were an attack on property is shown by several facts. Some discredit attached to Sulla's action, not explicable in view of the ease with which mere proscriptions were glossed over in other instances. Metellus Pius, a man thoroughly trusted by the average opinion of the oligarchy, and also a man high in Sulla's confidence, was put forward to interrogate him in a way which would have had no meaning if the measure had been purely a political proscription and nothing else. The dictator was asked, a significant question, where the executions were to stop and on what principle they were to be conducted. We do not ask you, said Metellus, to spare those whom you intend to destroy, but to free from doubt those you intend to spare. This was putting the matter plainly. Sulla replied ambiguously that he hardly knew whom he intended to spare. He was evidently reluctant to be drawn into public discussion. Tell us whom you will not spare, said Metellus. Pressed to this point, Sulla yielded. The first of the notorious proscription lists was published. It contained 80 names. The next day, he posted 220 additional names and followed this with a third list of equal length. Footnote. The actual numbers proscribed by Sulla have been exaggerated. Valerius Maximus says 4,700. Appian says 40 senators and 1,600 equites. The latter figures are probably correct. They may not include the retrospective confiscation of the property of men who had already fallen, nor the executions which were military rather than political measures. It is the inclusion of the latter which swelled the total to that given by Valerius Maximus. Mommsen suggests the figures. Proscription of Marius, 50 senators, 1,000 equites. Proscription of Sulla, 40 senators, 1,600 equites. These figures illustrate the argument in the text. Sulla's proscription fell heaviest on the equites. Hence the legal witticism that the prosecutors and judges had been executed, and only the advocates left. End footnote. They were accompanied by an edict forfeiting to the state the property of the proscribed, excluding their children and grandchildren from civil office, setting a reward of 12,000 denarii upon each head, and extending the proscription to any person who should harbor or protect one of the proscribed. The property of those who had already fallen was included in the confiscation. The publication of the lists, while no doubt it safeguarded certain individuals, drew down on Sulla's head the criticism he probably anticipated. He had to shoulder the entire responsibility. He had to endure the public belief that the whole affair was merely another example of his cynicism and levity. Public opinion, indeed, regarded this official publication and formal procedure as even worse than the frank personal vengeance of Marius. Sulla did not mollify his critics when he addressed them in the forum. He assured them that he had put down all the names he could remember at the moment, but if he had forgotten any, he would add them later. This produced silence, if not consent. The real nature of the proscription is shown more clearly than even by the questions of Metellus in the kind of story the Romans afterwards related concerning it. The less reputable elements among the Sullans had no doubt as to the objective in view. There was a rush to place upon the proscription list the name of every one who could profitably be plundered. Plutarch distinctly says that those who suffered for political reasons were few in comparison with those whose only offense was their wealth. Footnote: we have no means of estimating the precise value of this assertion. It may mean that those who had acted in civil or military office on behalf of the revolution were few in comparison with those who were proscribed for having been secret financial backers of Marius and Cinna. Sulla had more means than the general public possessed of knowing the identity of these men. Those who had bought up the property of refugees confiscated by Marius certainly went upon the list, so that in the knockout auctions the refugees must often have been simply buying back their own property. End footnote. It became the fashion, even among the Sullans, to say that this man had been killed by his house, that by his gardens, and another by his hot baths. One Quintus Aurelius, who took no part in politics and imagined that all he had to do with public affairs was to sympathize with the misfortunes of others, strolled into the forum to read the latest list. Finding his own name there, he cried out, "My Alban farm has informed against me." The notorious Lucius Sergius Catilina, who had murdered his own brother, legalized his position by getting his brother's name included in the proscription list. The case of Sextus Roscius of Ameria was a particularly bad one, and is well known on account of Cicero's share in the proceedings which brought it to light. By the complexity of Chrysogonus, Sulla's secretary, the name of the elder Roscius was placed upon the list of proscribed. He was then murdered by two of his kinsmen, and his wealth seized. When his fellow townsmen took steps to have this scandal put right, the conspirators accused the younger Roscius of the murder of his father, and proceeded to suborn witnesses to prove it. It was unlucky for them that the young man who acted as advocate for Roscius was Marcus Tullius Cicero. It is improbable that Sulla either intended or would voluntarily have allowed such disgraceful scandals as these, and they did not stand alone. He had intended something which, if unorthodox, was at any rate rational. There are faint indications that he resisted abuses where he could. Crassus received no further official employment after it was shown that he had illegally seized the property of a man who was not officially proscribed. But Sulla owed Crassus too much for severity to be possible, and, in fact, he owed a great many people too much. Footnote: Sulla's, quote, culpable indulgence, unquote, only means that he had not the power to restrain his servants and did not risk his authority by trying to do so. End footnote. There is nothing in Sulla's character, except the cynicism, which was a question of manners rather than morals, to suggest that he would deliberately unravel with one hand the fabric of law and order he was attempting to weave with the other. It was an integral part of the scheme that the confiscated property should be put up to public auction, where it was sold at knockout prices. Vast properties in this way changed hands for next to nothing. The profits, nevertheless, filled the public treasury to overflowing. Sulla shared in the purchases by way of setting the ball rolling, and also as a claimant justified in taking his share in this oblique scheme of compensation. Crassus did more. With his natural instinct for money, he bought on a huge scale and laid by this means the foundations of his afterwards immense fortune. Public opinion at large did not distinguish between any hypothetically legitimate or illegitimate method in these things. It seems to have taken the view that the whole scheme was a scandalous one, root and branch. Posterity has accepted this view, perhaps without inquiry. It is true enough that no amount of inquiry can square a political prescription with the laws of ethics, nor is there any way of palliating the monstrous cases of which those of Catilina and of the kinsman of Sextus Roscius are instances. Sulla paid the penalty. His name has ever since rested under a cloud which no one has been bold enough to lift. In the outcome, the objects at which he had aimed were achieved. The men who had designed the revolution and financed and inspired it and contemplated its atrocities and profited by them were swept away by a reign of terror which impressed the world, temporarily at least, as it was meant to do. The public treasury was refilled out of their confiscated property, and from the perhaps superabundant surplus, the exiles who had been ruined were handsomely compensated. It was not the rich alone who profited. The bitter inquiry was made whether the optimates had fought the civil war for the sole purpose of enriching their slaves and freedmen. The question was intended to reach the address of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Certain irrational emotions intrude into the best ordered lives, not to speak of those which are less well disciplined. Marius had passed beyond vengeance, if any man could have wreaked it on that grim soldier. By Sulla's command, his tomb was torn open, his bones scattered, a fate which has befallen many better men than he, and his memory outlawed. Marcus Marius Gratidianus, the adopted son of Marius's brother, was tortured to death at the tomb of Catullus as a sacrifice to the manes of that admirable and well-meaning man. The heads of the proscribed senators were publicly piled at the corner of the forum, where they were conveniently visible to their colleagues leaving the Senate House. And so little are the mere feelings of men related to the facts of life, especially of politics, that amid all these gestures, the man who, when Sulla was dead, was to succeed to the tradition of Marius and carry it to victory, passed unharmed. Gaius Julius Caesar was 21 years old in the year of Sulla's dictatorship. 4. Sulla's creative measures belonged to two types. He made an effort to collect about himself the core of a new aristocracy, and he drafted extensive schemes of practical reform. He was particularly anxious to unite Pompeius to himself by the closest bonds. Every man has a touch of paternal feeling, and it may be that Sulla longed for a son of whom he could be as proud as he would have been of Pompeius. He had no daughter of marriageable age, but Metella had a daughter, Aemilia, by her former marriage with Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. Sulla proposed that Pompeius should marry her. If ever Sulla showed folly and sentimentality, it was over Pompeius. Aemilia was married and was expecting a child. Pompeius also was married to Antistia, who had a tragic story. Her father had perished in the proscription the year before, when Scaevola fell, and her mother had become insane with grief and killed herself. This tale might well have been sufficient to ensure that Antistia should be left in peace, But since every man has at least a weak spot and must betray it at some moment in his life, this proved to be the accidental arrow which found the joint in Sulla's armor. Some things he could not see. He could not see that since an aristocracy is rooted in the quality of its hereditary gifts, it is therefore rooted in the purity of its family life. He did not get hold of the conception which any old Roman patrician would have shared with any modern Puritan, that marriage must not be tinkered with. He could not even catch the notion of chastity as a taboo. Considering the principle for which Sulla was standing, this was more than a venial fault. It was a flaw that ran right into the foundation of things. He thought it a perfectly satisfactory arrangement that Pompeius should divorce Antistia and marry Aemilia. Pompeius, always amenable, allowed himself to be persuaded. The match would be to his benefit. The result was that Antistia was divorced and Aemilia married to him, whereupon Aemilia promptly died. It was, of course, a pity. But Sulla had the stepson he wanted, and Pompeius had the Sicilian command. Another promising possibility for the new aristocracy was young Gaius Julius Caesar. Sulla had marked him from the first. Caesar, however, was the nephew of Marius and the son-in-law of Cinna. Sulla proposed that he should divorce Cornelia. Unlike Pompeius, Caesar was a genuine, if not a perfect, aristocrat. He coldly declined. He disapproved of Sulla's politics, and probably of his private character, and the fall of empires and the crash of worlds, or even considerable personal inconvenience, would not have made Caesar do anything he did not choose to do. Nor would Caesar withdraw from his own activities. He put down his name as a candidate for the priesthood, an important official position in its way. Sulla at once pulled the strings and saw that he was rejected. He even contemplated placing Caesar's name on the proscription list. Here, however, he encountered the reality, as distinct from the theory, of aristocracy. Young Gaius was a remarkably important person in the inner social world of Rome. His descent was not merely blue-blooded, but azure in its augustness. He was very rich and very charming in a curious, cold, impersonal way. He pulled the strings himself. At once, all the social wheels were at work. The most highly placed people intervened to persuade Sulla. Even the College of Vestal Virgins took up the case. Sulla was constrained, but he said, frankly, that they were blind not to see many Mariuses in that boy. Footnote. This story rests on as good evidence as most such anecdotes. It may be a little too good to be true, but Sulla was certainly an astute psychologist. End footnote. When this was reported to him, for he was the kind of man who heard all the news going, Caesar quietly effaced himself. He spent the time in lounging from one to another of his country properties in the Sabine district, till one evening he unexpectedly ran into a party of sullen soldiers who were looking for likely people. Caesar tipped the commanding centurion 2 talents, a proceeding which fulfilled all the necessities of the situation. But feeling the Sabine district to be less restful than he had hoped, he decided to take a tour in the east, where he remained until Sulla was dead. However, there was still Pompeius, the perfect aristocrat. Sulla had not lost hope. The men whom Sulla could manage, men like Metellus Pius and the younger Catullus, were, perhaps just because he could manage them, in another way equally unsatisfactory. They had all the qualities which enable men to work together loyally and amicably. good sense, good temper, adequacy to the ordinary calls of government, sufficiency of stability and balance. They admirably fulfilled some of the tests of aristocracy, but they lacked precisely the very power which is the determining factor in political success, ability to meet the unexpected. Such a man as Metellus had every gift except originality and adaptability. Whatsoever the cause may have been, aristocracy in Rome seemed to have reached a point at which intelligence and discipline were separating out as distinct and mutually exclusive elements. How elusive they were is clearly seen in the remarkable incident of the younger Cato. Sulla seems to have cast a hopeful eye on the juvenile population, and young Marcus Cato, among others, was frequently brought to Sulla's house by his tutor, where he took an observant interest in the proceedings. His final comment was, quote, "Why does nobody kill this man?" unquote. The alarmed tutor promptly terminated the visits. In view of the later career of Cato, we are irresistibly led to the deduction that what he disliked in Sulla was what he disliked in Caesar, namely, intelligence. Sulla's searching interest did not stop at the oligarchy. Following his systematic principle of making one action serve many ends, he selected from the slaves of the proscribed, who came under the hammer with the rest of the property involved, the best men he could find, set them free, and incorporated them into a body known as the Cornelians. They numbered about 10,000. This step had precedence in the earlier history of Rome. It was no innovation. It represented a deliberate and careful choice of new blood for citizenship, and gave the new men a peculiarly strong interest in the maintenance of the new constitution which Sulla was creating. 5. The populares had spent 2 years in power without being able to think of any reforms to carry out. Sulla's period of dictatorship proved to be a torrent of practical reform. There was not the least trace of the spirit of Metternich about him. The most radical of the populares was less radical than he when faced by a necessity and an opportunity. The oligarchy looked on, humble and mystified, in the background. He confirmed the grant of the franchise to the Italians and brought to its full fruit the policy of Drusus. Henceforward, any citizen of an Italian community was a citizen of Rome, and all distinction between the old and the new citizens was swept away. On the day on which this was done, the old city-state ceased to exist, and the modern nation was born. It was an infant, helpless and unconscious, destined to struggle for many a century before it grew up. But it was born, and Sulla was the surgeon who ushered it into the world. To accompany this measure, he made great changes in the local government of Italy. Hitherto, political conceptions had been limited by the principle, from which no thinker had been able to escape, of the city as the political unit. Prior to Sulla's day, there had been, broadly speaking, only 2 methods of uniting the subject cities with Rome. They could be declared independent communities in alliance with Rome, when they retained their own separate government and had no power of influencing Roman policy. Or, alternatively, they could be given the franchise when they became part of Rome and were, of course, governed by the Roman magistrates, while their citizens traveled to Rome to exercise the vote, if they ever exercised it at all. Since all Italy was now in the Roman franchise, it had become a physical impossibility for the Roman magistrates to carry on the local affairs of the Italian cities, and the clumsy old arrangements had to give way. Sulla instituted a definite scheme of local self-government, each city being given a constitution modeled on that of Rome for the purpose of managing its own affairs, while the Roman magistrates retained the power of control and special jurisdiction over those matters which involved general policy, such as are now exercised by a national government. It was beyond Sulla. It was indeed beyond any man until, in the course of ages, the problem was solved by a natural evolution, to devise a scheme by which the distant citizens could take their legal share in the election of the Roman magistrates and in Roman legislation. They could, of course, go to Rome for the purpose, but probably few ever did so. It was, on general grounds, not even desirable that they should go. This was the fatal flaw which rendered democracy impossible in the new Rome. Nor was this all. With the forfeitures which had accrued from the cities condemned for participation in the late Civil War, and from the proscriptions, Sulla set on foot great schemes of land settlement. He granted 120,000 small holdings to the discharged soldiers of his armies, thus resettling Italy with precisely the class of small farmer who was most needed, and at the same time fortifying his new arrangements with the zealous support of men who had everything to lose by their alteration. To strengthen the position of the new settlers, he made their land inalienable, and he abolished the corn dole, which had done so much to destroy the small Italian farmer. Everything he could do to make the settlements permanent, he did. Sulla next dealt with the equites, that class of bankers and merchants whose political exploits we have been chiefly engaged in surveying. He abolished their control over the courts and handed the latter back to the senatorial order. He swept away all the privileges that had made them a definite class in the state. They had made much of their money by the odious Gracchan system of farming the taxes. Sulla, having seen for himself in Asia what the tax farming system was capable of producing, abolished it altogether and converted the taxes into fixed amounts. He had seen the day when great men were murdered for even suggesting these measures. He had lived long enough to pass them himself, and the equites trembled and obeyed. Having taken the courts away from the equites, he proceeded to a fierce and stringent reform of the courts themselves. He created 8 different judicial courts for the trial of various types of case. He separated civil from criminal justice for the first time in the history of law, and originated the system by which civil cases were tried by a single judge, and criminal cases by a bench of judges, or jury, as we should call it. Since, among these courts, he created one for the trial of cases of murder, he practically abolished the death penalty, for the citizen assembly retained its sole right to produce sentence of death, and murder cases were now withdrawn from its cognizance. Moreover, since another of his courts was for the trial of cases of treason, he made it much less likely that any special partisan tribunal like that of Quintus Varius would ever again be set up. All these measures had a purpose, and suggest that he had a good memory. Every one of them covered the ground of some old notorious scandal of Roman government. His court, De Repetundis, for example, was largely the fruit of his experience in Asia. It was intended to make impossible, or at any rate less probable, such proceedings as those which had caused the Mithridatic War. The arguments of Archelaus and of Mithridates had had their effect. Finally, he turned to the Senate, into whose control he had restored the courts, and here his reforms reached their culmination. The jurisdiction of the censor had been used by the oligarchy to pass its friends into the Senate and to expel as many men of enlightenment from it as possible. Sulla avenged Publius Cornelius and his 10 pounds of silver plate by completely abolishing this censorial power. He made senators irremovable. To restore the balance, he caused entrance to the state to depend upon popular election. A seat in the Senate was to be the corollary of election to a magistracy. The supremacy of the citizen assembly Sulla left untouched, but he provided that the only measures which should be proposed to it for legislation should be such as had passed the Senate and were forwarded to it for ratification. He put the citizen assembly practically into the legislative position of a modern constitutional king who has the right of assent or veto, but nothing more. As part of this scheme, he reorganized the magistracies. He increased the numbers of the magistrates to enable them to deal with the increasing amount of business that passed through their hands. Two especial objects seem to have been before his mind. First, he attempted to keep apart the civil and the military powers, and to give the supremacy to the statesman rather than the soldier. He made it impossible for a civil magistrate to hold at the same time a military office. Secondly, he made it illegal to hold an office for several years in succession. He regulated and consolidated the laws relating to these matters, and enforced the old laws with regard to the age at which a candidate was eligible for office. These measures had several aims. They prevented the magistracies from becoming the close preserve of a clique who continued their friends in profitable posts year after year because there were not sufficient magistrates to make possible the yearly change in the provincial governorships. The increase in the number of magistracies enabled the work to be done by properly elected men who laid down office at the legal time, so that there was no further excuse for informal prolongations. And the increase provided the requisite number of qualified senators, men of official experience who knew something of the business of administration. The amateur senator, whose only claim to the dignity was his social position in a wealthy oligarchy, was swept away. One leading fact is betrayed by these reforms of the magistracies. Sulla was so careful to refurbish and restore the old republican machinery of government with its limited annual tenure of office, so careful to prevent the tribunes from holding the legislative initiative in the citizen assembly as Gaius Gracchus had held it, so particularly careful to render it impossible for any man to hold the consulship for several years in succession as Marius had held it, that his motive in making these arrangements must have been especially strong. It is on the definiteness of his policy in this respect that we can build up the proof that his opposition to Marius was no mere question of personal ambition or party prejudice, but was rooted in a genuine difference of political principle. Sulla had a good deal more than the amount of intelligence necessary to imagine a simple logical extension of the 6 successive consulships of Marius. Why stop at 6? Why not, indeed, a permanent consulship? Why not a monarchy? This was the strategic point at which Sulla struck. He aimed at rendering it impossible ever to develop a Roman magistracy into monarchy. And this is again precisely the point on which Caesar sided with Marius and against Sulla. Thus far, however, the advantage in point of enlightenment must be adjudged to Sulla. Monarchy, as they knew it, was an old, outworn, reactionary, incompetent principle. A man who seriously proposed to renovate it as a necessary and vital element in political life would need to create a new form of monarchy, standing in a new relationship to the rest of the state. Sulla was certainly not called upon to provide his opponents with a political philosophy. He had little personal sympathy with monarchy. To him, as to most Romans, it seemed at the best a barbarous expedient for saving idle citizens from the trouble of exercising their own brains and shouldering their own responsibilities. He had no disposition to wear himself into an untimely grave by doing other people's work for them. He saw the problem before him as a question whether Rome should remain a growing, self-determined political state whose voice was found by the conference of all the classes and citizens who composed it, or become a state obeying the arbitrary will of a despot who, however enlightened he might chance to be, would nevertheless determine for men what men had hitherto determined for themselves. 6. During the first year of his dictatorship, therefore, consuls were elected as usual, and the ordinary course of administration pursued its way while he was engaged in creating the new constitution. For the second year, he himself came forward as a candidate and exercised the normal office while still dictator for the purpose of his special functions. His colleague was Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, a stroke, Sulla ambiguously remarked, of fortune, since Metellus was likely to be an amiable passenger. And it is hardly possible to doubt his motives. Having reformed the Constitution, he was determined to start it upon its new career by a year in office as an ordinary magistrate, giving a concrete example of how it should be worked, and seeing for himself what rough corners there might be in it. He still had the power to remedy these. There was, indeed, no external reason why he should ever surrender the dictatorship. But whatever other men might think, the mere fact of his consulship hinted at a personal bias against regarding his dictatorship as permanent. It is distinctly apparent that in this, too, Sulla was allowing private feeling to blind him to the real state of the case. His supremacy was not so easily to be got rid of. That admirable condition of equality among themselves, which had marked the old patricians, as it marks every true aristocracy, was based upon an actual equality of character and intelligence. But Sulla's position was based upon an actual inequality. There were not two Sullas, still less were there 500. Whether he liked it or not, he had, in practice, to recognize its reality by many exceptional actions quite incompatible with his theory, and so was forced into inconsistencies which did not escape public criticism. Much was attributed to arbitrariness of temperament, and even to savage cynicism, which may have been due far more to a conscious effort to square two different conceptions of duty. Sulla could not escape the dilemma. To restore law by despotic decree and order by violence is an inconsistency which attracts attention. No one took him seriously when he insisted on the necessity of discipline and obedience. No one even realized that he was wholly in earnest. Still less was it comprehended that this, and not his external reforms, was the core of his aims. The proscription lists hung round Sulla's neck. No one could distinctly see anything else. No one could see or hear or feel or touch or taste anything about Sulla except that he was the author of the great proscription. End of Chapter 11. The Dictatorship of Sulla. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 12 of Sulla the Fortunate, the Great Dictator, by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Death of Sulla. 1. The trend of affairs illustrates once more the logic of events which began to entangle Sulla. The perfect aristocrat had gone to Sicily, where the remains of the populares were collecting. Perpenna had taken command of the exiles and refugees. Carbo had collected a navy, while Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus was raising an army in Africa. Perpenna did not wait long. He evacuated Sicily. Pompeius was incorrigibly good-natured and also incorrigibly lawless. He treated Sicily with liberality and seems to have accepted a large number of excuses which would not have passed muster in Rome. He could not, indeed, avoid the necessity for many executions when the notorious facts were too strong for him, but whenever he could cultivate a blind eye, he did so. Carbo, who fell into his hands, had a legal trial, a proceeding adversely commented upon in Rome, where it was argued that young Pompeius had no right to insult a man of consular dignity by solemnly sitting in judgment upon him, and that it would have been more respectful to have executed him out of hand. Quintus Valerius, a man of considerable learning, was another case. Instead of suffering immediate death, Valerius was brought to a personal interview with Pompeius, and it was only after a long conversation that Pompeius, finding him obdurate, reluctantly ordered his execution. These cases might conceivably be due to a young man's sense of prudence in dealing with political opponents who are far from being friendless and very often far from being socially uninfluential. But such instances as that of the city of Himera show that it was more than this. Himera was so deeply involved in revolutionary activity that when Pompeius opened his tribunal, it seemed certain that the city would receive heavy punishment. Cethenis, one of the leading citizens, publicly assured Pompeius that this would be to punish the innocent and let the guilty go free. Pompeius asked who, in that case, would accept responsibility for all that had been done, whereupon Cethenis answered that he would do so, who had compelled his friends by persuasion and his enemies by fear. This seems to have impressed Pompeius so favorably that he passed over the conduct of Himera. He kept very strict discipline, and when the conduct of his troops was made a subject of complaint, he had their swords officially sealed into the scabbards. The suspicion always clung about Pompeius to the end of his life that he loved praise and admiration so much that he could not resist the temptation to curry favor with any human being at the expense of more important considerations. The criticism was unjust, for a great deal, perhaps all, of his good nature was perfectly genuine. He lacked a certain severity of temperament which made the typical Roman both harsh and also law-abiding. The circumstances of the day had certainly discouraged the spirit of strict obedience to law, but Pompeius showed a distinct tendency to disregard forms. Among the incidents of his Sicilian command was reported his remark to the Mamertines when they put in their Roman charter as a defense. "Will you never stop talking of law to us who carry swords?" There was much in all this that disappointed Sulla, who was intent on the restoration of severe discipline and the old patrician obedience. Caesar was the man he really wanted, but by the irony of fate, Caesar was one of the men with whom he could not get on, or who could not get on with him. He removed Pompeius to Africa. There was no doubt of the military competence of the perfect aristocrat, and Domitius was assembling an army that constituted a serious menace. The reports of the perfect aristocrat grew worse. His relations with the troops were admirably good, too good to be altogether admirable in some eyes. Shortly after their arrival in Africa, one of the soldiers discovered a buried treasure, whereupon, in spite of all orders, the whole army was soon digging furiously, while Pompeius walked to and fro and laughed at them. No further treasure being found, the army came to its senses and apologized, and the way in which he took the incident added much to his popularity. He defeated Domitius, stormed his camp, and reduced Africa to order within 40 days of his landing, and then, ascertaining that lions and elephants were still existent in Numidia, went off on a big game hunting expedition. Sulla now wrote to recall him. Capable though Pompeius was, he was very young, and there was in his actions an element of casualness, perhaps difficult to isolate and blame, yet not altogether consistent with dignity. Moreover, considering that he had never occupied any official post, but was merely a special military deputy, his personal popularity with the troops raised serious questions. Along such lines as were here possible, there would be no revival of the ideal Rome, but only some kind of Greek military tyranny. Sulla was trying to suppress precisely this danger of military tyranny and endeavoring to confirm the supremacy of law and civil government. Pompeius had better come home and be with Sulla for a while. With experience and good companionship, he would learn, and the military task had been accomplished with success. Sulla was wise. As soon as the order of recall was known, the troops broke out into a demonstration of loyalty to their commander, which was only divided by the narrowest of margins from open rebellion. The news was actually dispatched to Sulla that Pompeius had raised the standard of revolt. His bitter comment was, quote, "It seems that it is my fate to strive with children in my old age," unquote. But further and more reliable information put a somewhat different complexion on the matter. Pompeius and his army had carried on a highly emotional argument, accompanied by tears and speeches, which had ended in the army submitting to reason. But the perfect aristocrat would have been more perfect than any aristocrat ever is if he had not gained the justifiable impression that he could do nearly anything he liked with a crowd. 2. There were undercurrents. The lightness of Pompeius's hand in Sicily was known, and the welcome prepared for him in Rome was equivalent to a political demonstration against Sulla. Very few people understood much or cared much about the virtues of the new constitution, except that it had in some way or other trenched on everybody's rights and satisfied no one. What they knew, what obsessed them to the exclusion of most other things, the label that stuck to Sulla, the medium through which everyone saw him, was that he had been the author of the Great Proscription. It was not easy for him to prevent a demonstration in favor of his own favorite. Sulla did the only thing that could be done. He took the wind out of his enemy's sails by outdistancing them all in the fervor of his enthusiasm. He was the first to greet Pompeius and to fall upon his handsome neck, hailing him with the honorary title of Magnus, the Great, and commanding all present to acclaim him by that title. Pompeius, in perhaps a slightly different spirit, did not take this title any more seriously than that of Imperator. It was a long while before he added it to his signature, but the name stuck. He was always Pompeius Magnus. Sulla's sincerity may not have been so obvious as on the former occasion. But the perfect aristocrat was not quite so perfect as he had once appeared. He asked for a triumph. Sulla pointed out that he had held no office. A triumph was an honor legally given only to commanders of consular or praetorian rank, so that even Scipio Africanus had not enjoyed a triumph for his Spanish campaigns. If he granted it, it would discredit his government and nullify his efforts to restore the rule of law. Pompeius was not convinced. He seemed to think these arguments an additional reason why he should have a triumph. It would be particularly good to have what no one else had ever had. Sulla intimated that he would use his authority to stop any such idea. Pompeius reminded Sulla that more people worship the rising than the setting sun. Sulla had perhaps just resumed his seat in a mood of annoyance, for he did not catch the remark. But noticing by the obvious sensation around him that something unusual must have been said, he inquired what it was. When it was repeated to him, he seemed thunderstruck, and then cried out, "Let him triumph! Let him triumph!" After all, what did it matter? There would never be a new Rome. There was no perfect aristocrat. Let him triumph. Sulla must have known from that moment that his work was vain. He had merely patched up the old oligarchic Rome. So Pompeius enjoyed his triumph. He had a great plan for having his triumphal car drawn by elephants, but unfortunately the gates were too narrow, so that the old conventional method of employing horses had to be retained. The triumph was a little spoiled by the troops, who did not think that Pompeius had given them a sufficient donation. But it was popular. Enthusiasm for Pompeius was the easiest way of demonstrating against Sulla. Pompeius, with the wisdom that is given to babes and sucklings, had spoken the truth. Sulla's sun was setting. His work, for good or for evil, had been done to the best of his abilities. but it was hard that its doom should be pronounced by the very man whose example and person were to have ushered in the new era. Caesar was an enemy, too powerful to be crushed, and Pompeius was a fool, a gilded soldier, a Greek tyrant. The labor of restoration was to have been only the framework for the task of creation, and this was all that was left of the new aristocracy. 3. Sulla was not a man to enact a private tragedy. He was more the kind of man who, in trouble, goes out and gets drunk. He grew sharper and more cynical and more bohemian in his private enjoyments. He now made up his mind and prepared to resign the dictatorship. The work he had done, others must carry on. He had tried to restore a spiritual state, an atmosphere. He had not tried to make himself a monarch. The Romans could therefore carry on his intentions, or not, as they chose, and have Pompeius, if they liked Pompeius better. Sulla dedicated a tenth of his fortune to Hercules, the doer of great deeds, and gave a public feast of many days' duration. He silently underlined the occasion by producing nothing less than the Opimian wine, the immortal vintage of that year when Gaius Gracchus fell. He had spent most of his mature life in fighting the results of the Gracchian policy, particularly that aspect of it which had wrested the control of government from the responsible political authorities and given it into the unofficial, irresponsible hands of financiers and traders. He would toast himself out of office on the appropriate vintage. His meaning seems to have been recognized, for many people, probably the financiers, held aloof, so that every day of the feast much food had to be thrown into the river for want of eaters. The bankers were not beaten yet. Fortune herself held aloof from that feast. The ill luck which dogged all those who had to do with the fall of the Gracchi pursued even Sulla when he invited it by this broad gesture. In the midst of the feasting, Metella fell sick and lay dying. Forbidden by the official ritual from visiting the sick or polluting his house with mourning, he sent her a divorce and caused her to be removed to another house. Though he accepted the ceremonial necessity with a calm which somewhat disturbed his critics, it was not from indifference, for as soon as he was absolved from its jurisdiction, he gave her a magnificent funeral in which he defiantly broke his own sumptuary law, limiting the expenditure permissible on such occasions. Sulla began to go downhill after his breach with Pompeius and the death of Metella. He did not observe his own sumptuary laws, even in his own private entertainments. His parties of unconventional friends grew more numerous and more costly. But he was still a man of business, who could wear the mask well enough in business hours and throw it off cheerfully after them. A few months after Metella's death, he was sitting in the theater when someone, in passing, plucked a few hairs from his woolen cloak. It was a handsome girl. Sulla looked up in surprise and asked what that meant. There was no harm, she answered, in sharing in his fortune, and she went on to her seat. Sulla was intrigued and made inquiries. She was Valeria Messala, the sister of Hortensius the orator. He kept his eye upon her, and they carried on the kind of affair that can so easily be conducted by looks alone. A Valeria of the great Messallan family was as good as a Cornelius of the Sullan branch, and Sulla was attracted. He made overtures, was accepted, and married her. But he made little change in his manner of life. He saw enough of social distinction and formal greatness during business hours to enjoy the company of a different sort of person in his leisure moments. There is no sign that Valeria influenced him or engaged more than a passing interest. 4. The time came round, and with it the elections and the vacation of office by the old magistrates. Pompeius had set an example, and Ofella now followed it. He came forward as a candidate for the consulship, for which he was not legally eligible. Sulla prohibited the candidature, but Ofella persisted and appeared in the forum with an armed bodyguard. But Ofella was not Pompeius. Sulla, sitting in the Temple of Concord, from which he overlooked the whole forum as from a gallery, sent a centurion across to cut down Ofella. When the uproar had subsided, Sulla rose and addressed the crowd. He was making a last appeal to their sense of obedience to law. He told them that he had authorized the act, which was therefore a legal execution and not a murder, and he commanded them to release the centurion. He explained to them precisely what Ofella had done. There was once a husbandman, he concluded dryly, who was much troubled by vermin. Twice he took off his shirt and shook it. On the third occasion he burned the shirt. Take care that the city of Rome is not like that shirt. With this grim and prophetical parable, he ended his career as a public speaker. Pompeius was canvassing in person for another candidate, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, whereas Sulla was supporting Quintus Lutatius Catulus, the son of his old friend and commander. Lepidus was the kind of man particularly obnoxious to Sulla, an ex-governor of Sicily who, to escape a prosecution for extortion, had left the optimates for the populares, a violent and fluent speaker of doubtful character and still more doubtful wisdom. Lepidus had little chance of election without help. The popularity of Pompeius was the factor which turned the scale in his favor. As they were leaving the forum afterwards, Sulla came forward and spoke to Pompeius. "Young man," he said, "I see that you rejoice in your victory, and no doubt you think it a matter for congratulation that that scoundrel Lepidus is elected before an honorable man such as Catulus. But have a care for yourself, for you are strengthening an enemy at your own expense." These, as far as we know, were the last words which ever passed between Sulla and his ideal aristocrat, and they might have formed the epitaph of Pompeius. He strengthened his enemies at his own expense. With the opening of the new official year, Sulla divested himself of the dictatorship. Those who hoped and those who feared that he never would do so were alike disappointed. His resignation impressed his contemporaries. There was something great in the proceeding, but men were not agreed as to the exact nature of the greatness. Considered as a gesture, was it the noble act of a public-spirited man too large for the little glories of kingship? Or was it the contemptuous act of a cynic weary of doing good to Rome? They could not tell, for none of them understood Sulla. Both motives may have had their part. Sulla not only resigned, but, self-stripped of his sanctity as dictator, walked publicly in the forum, a private man again, so that anyone who chose could call him to account for his acts. No one did so. No one questioned him. But a young man followed him home, denouncing him and all his works, which Sulla endured with fortitude. It is surmised by historians that the proceeding was carefully staged by Sulla's orders, and the surmise is possible. It would have been like Sulla's perverse humor to stage an opposition of one man. The joke would have been good. But then it would have been only a joke, and Sulla's sense of humor was ample enough to have enjoyed far more the amusing reality of being actually abused by one young man. We are none the wiser for the remark he made as he re-entered his house. This young man will prevent any future holder of such power as mine from laying it down again. A truly Delphic comment, on which 2,000 years of puzzled silence fell. Having done this much, he retired to his Campanian villa, and the world had little more to hear of him. The career of Lucius Cornelius Sulla was over. 5. It was over in more senses than one. Sickness was creeping over him, in no way fended off by his habits. He had not at first noticed its approach, but it revealed itself more and more. It was an intestinal ulceration. Its symptoms, as related by his biographer, are obscure, but the probability is that he was attacked by one of those internal parasites which are known to modern medical science, though beyond the control of the physicians of his own day. He may have acquired it in Asia. He was ordered a course of hot baths, without result. During this, his last year of life, he hunted, occupied himself in reorganizing the municipal affairs of the neighboring city of Puteoli, a task which he took as seriously as the reorganization of Rome, and completed his autobiography, dedicated to Lucius Lucullus, and finished only a few days before his death. In it, he mentioned that the Chaldeans, probably those who accompanied the Parthian ambassador in the days of his Cilician propraetorship, had foretold him a life of honor to conclude in the fullness of prosperity. It may have been as well not to drag it out. He had apparently no regrets, and he said that he had had a dream in which he had seen his son stand by him in mourning attire, bidding him cast off further care and come with him to Metella to live in peace and comfort with her. The day before his death, he heard that one Granius, a public official of Puteoli, had, in the expectation of his demise, declined to discharge a public debt. Sulla was not dead yet, and the news touched all his most violent prejudices. Disobedience, dishonesty, only waiting for him to go. He had Granius summoned to his presence and strangled. But in the excitement, for he seems to have spoken heatedly, he burst a blood vessel. He passed the night in acute pain and died probably towards morning. He left behind him 2 children, Faustus and Fausta, by Metella, and after his death Valeria was delivered of a daughter. When his will was read, it was noticed that Pompeius was passed over in silence. Lucullus was his executor and the guardian of his children. No word came across the grave to the perfect aristocrat, but Pompeius had no ill feeling. There was a widespread movement to prevent Sulla receiving a public funeral, and when it was decided, against the traditional usage of the Cornelian house, to cremate the body, Lepidus intervened to stop the deposition of the ashes in the Campus Martius. Pompeius came in person to Campania, took charge of the body, and conveyed it to Rome. All his power and influence were employed to protect the defenseless dead man who had been so powerful in life. Even Lepidus could not interfere with Pompeius. The womenfolk of the optimates contributed the funeral spices for their party chief. Such vast amounts were subscribed that in addition to what was borne on 210 litters, a large figure of Sulla, attended by a lictor, the mark of the Dictator, was made out of the frankincense and cinnamon. It was a dull, threatening day, and those in charge were doubtful about carrying out the corpse. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they at last risked it, still fearing that rain would prevent the ceremony. Sulla's body was borne on a golden bier with royal splendor, preceded by horsemen and trumpeters. The pall-bearers were senators. His standards and fasces went before. The procession was enormous. Over 2,000 golden crowns were carried in it, the gifts of cities, legions, or individual friends. All the guilds of priests and priestesses followed, the entire Senate, the whole body of magistrates, a great number of equites in regalia, and all his veterans in their due legionary ranks, bearing their full-dress golden ensigns and silver-mounted shields. Young Faustus was not of age to deliver the funeral oration, so the first public speakers of the day accepted the office on his behalf. The cheers of farewell were raised by the ranks in order, beginning with the senators and ending with the plebeians. The wind blew up the flame, and the pyre burned splendidly. Everything was consumed in good time, and the fire was dying to its embers when at last the rain came and continued till nightfall. So, as Plutarch says, his fortune continued with him to the last, and even officiated at his funeral. His monument was erected in the Campus Martius, with the epitaph, composed by himself, that no man had excelled him in doing a good turn to his friends, or a bad one to his foes. End of Chapter 12. The Death of Sulla. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 13 of Sulla the Fortunate, the Great Dictator, by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Death of Sulla's World. 1. No sooner was Sulla dead than all the powers and forces which he had held in check were once more set free. How powerful they were we can see by the promptitude of their action. The utmost that Sulla had done had not destroyed, nor even seriously weakened them. But they were forces that could not act directly. They needed a representative, and they could, as then, find none better than Lepidus. The struggle was not a long one. Before many months were out, Pompeius was able to inform the Senate that the danger was over. Lepidus was dead. His armies were dissolved. Sulla's work had marked a period. To undo what he had done, the Equites would need to find and finance a man greater than Lepidus, greater than Pompeius, perhaps greater than Marius, if such a man could be found. To understand the career of Sulla, we must continue the story a little further and review the processes by which his work was undermined and destroyed. He had been right when he quoted the Chaldean prediction that he should die in the fullness of prosperity. With his invariable good fortune, that is what he had done. Had he lived, it would have been to see his own failure develop with an inevitable necessity out of the circumstances he had left, for he had failed in the essential task, the creation of a new aristocracy. He had only restored an oligarchy, and there it was, without difference or improvement. His real success lay in the fact that he had dragged Rome by the short hairs through the most dangerous series of crises she had ever had to face. He had succeeded as a practical statesman. He had at least left Rome pretty much as he found it, instead of a silent city of ruins, fast being forgotten. But he was destined to fail as a creative idealist. This is a habit fortune has. She is willing to help men to great practical successes, but she reserves the task of creation for herself. The Equites had reasons for anxiety which increased with time. Stripped of all the advantages and privileges which Gaius Gracchus had given them, they were faced with conditions slipping steadily from bad to worse. The old oligarchy had been of angelic light and wisdom compared with the new oligarchy which Sulla left behind him. Beside the men of the new senatorial courts who acquitted Gnaeus Dolabella, the men of the old equestrian juries who condemned Publius Rutilius Rufus might justly feel themselves patterns of judicial virtue. The scandals of misgovernment, which began with the two Dolabellas, found their towering peak of iniquity in the notorious case of Verres. Such misgovernment could not fail to reflect itself in damage to commercial interests, which gave a sharper edge to opposition than simple righteous indignation could have given. There were several loose ends to Sulla's work, from any or all of which it might be unraveled. He had left the East hardly pacified. Mithridates was steadily rebuilding his power. The seas, after half a generation of anarchy, were swarming with organized piracy. It was still conceivable that Rome might lose the East. And, complete though Sulla's victory may have seemed, the most brilliant of all the populares was still defending the last ditch. Quintus Sertorius, driven out of Italy, had taken to a roving life as a captain of what later ages would have called free companions. After many remarkable adventures, which may be read in Plutarch's life of him, he formed a government in Lusitania, which he conducted with admirable ability and success. For some 8 years he held his own against all the forces which the oligarchy could send against him. He had genius as a soldier, and perhaps genius as a statesman, as we can see by the interesting account which Plutarch gives of the college he founded for the sons of Lusitanian chiefs, an educational institution none the less real because the youths were not only students, but also hostages for their parents' loyalty. Quintus Metellus Pius entirely failed to deal with Sertorius. From the personal point of view, the career of Sertorius in Spain was a romantic tragedy ending in failure and death. But in its political aspect, it was a triumph of unconventional genius, which altered the course of history. The consequences were incalculable. The Senate was compelled at last, much against its will, to send Pompeius to Spain with proconsular power. Even Pompeius met his match in Sertorius. Mithridates seized the opportunity to reopen the war in the East. On top of this, the gladiators broke out of the training school at Capua, elected a Thracian named Spartacus as their leader, and planted war in the midst of Italy itself. Spartacus, the slave Napoleon, is an illustration of the danger and difficulty of dealing with a European as a slave. Here, thrown up accidentally, was a man of military genius, at least equal to Sertorius, equal, for all we know, to Hannibal. For Spartacus was never defeated in a strictly military sense. For 2 whole years he defeated every army which the oligarchy could raise. He could have broken out of Italy and gone free to the wide if his men would have followed him. But Spartacus illustrates another thesis also, the importance of political as distinct from military factors in war. He fell because his slave army had not the close-knit disciplinary construction of the Roman state. When we disentangle the events of these years, between the death of Sulla and the rise of Caesar, a number of interesting truths emerge. The Roman state, when confronted by mere force or external danger, was still rigid enough and solid enough to defy all assault. Her internal coherence resisted the fourfold strain put upon it by Sertorius, Spartacus, Mithridates, and the Cilician corsairs. It was her own evolution, her own processes of internal growth that were the difficulty. Over these she was constricted, crippled, and strangled. She blundered through to victory under circumstances of the most scandalous nature, which shocked and disgusted her best citizens and convinced them that vast changes were imperative. The downfall of Sertorius was the first to come. It demonstrated once more the inherent weakness of the popular party, its inability to keep itself proof against internal treachery, its lack of cohesion. Sertorius was assassinated by members of his own party, fellow exiles who were jealous of him with the feeble-minded jealousy of those who envy a man they cannot replace and whose work they cannot do. When the conspirators promptly fell into the hands of Pompeius and the lawful government, Pompeius had a delicate problem to deal with. They offered, as ransom for their lives, the correspondence of Sertorius, containing many letters completely incriminating a large number of important individuals in Italy. It is perfectly obvious that the popular party was far from dead, that the movement against the oligarchy, afterwards headed by Caesar, was already in being, and that Sertorius was a forerunner of Caesar, though an unlucky one, without Caesar's fortune, either material or spiritual. Pompeius chose a course for which he deserves every praise as a wise and right-minded man. He burnt the correspondence unread and unrevealed on the ground that enough blood had been shed, and that it was time to let ill alone. Had Pompeius been more short-sightedly prudent in a partisan sense, he might have stamped out the Caesarian revolution. But had he done so, he might have stamped out Rome as well. Very little margin, in the end, saved the Mediterranean civilization from dissolution into anarchy. Another hint of importance is given us by the circumstances of Sertorius' death and the revelation it brought about. We can see that the precise type of the Caesarian revolution, its militaristic nature, arose naturally out of such facts as these. It was impossible to make a watertight party out of the populares, save by means of military discipline. The powerful pressure of interest kept the oligarchy unfalteringly united. The populares had no such motives to bind them together. Caesar must have seen in these years that the only possible solution of the problem was to bind them in the strong bonds of soldierly association. And there was no other solution within the reach of a practical statesman who must produce immediate results. Pompeius returned from Spain in the following year to find that, as regards Spartacus, the oligarchy had been driven to place itself in the hands of Crassus as a sort of political liquidator in bankruptcy. Crassus was excellently adapted for the task. Though not a great soldier, he had precisely the faculties required. He organized the war as if it had been a bank or a business, and overwhelmed Spartacus by mobilizing against him the resources which a civilized political state can command. When Pompeius arrived, just in time to help in wiping the servile army off the earth, both these old disciples of Sulla were in a changed mood. They had begun to see matters from a different point of view. They were not, as it happened, friends. A third power, anonymous and indefinite, intervened to make a link between them, while their armies still stood intact. This third power seemed to know the change in their minds. It seemed to have the power of saying and doing the things which would bring Crassus and Pompeius together. It seemed to possess the diplomatic ability to secure for itself a price for its intervention. 2. Crassus and Pompeius held the consulship together for the ensuing official year. The joint power, once united with that of the anonymous third factor, who controlled the electors of the old party of the populares, was sufficient to compel the oligarchy. Besides the consulship, Pompeius received a triumph, and Crassus an ovation, and, judging by subsequent events, there may well have been secret clauses to the agreement which only time would reveal. In return, the populares received their price. The Sullan constitution was abolished. Pompeius himself introduced the law which sent the tribunes back to the assembly with all their old powers. The courts were once more handed over, though not so absolutely as before, to the equites. The tax farming system was revived. The censorship was restored. We have no difficulty in perceiving whose interests were served by these changes. The anonymous third power did more than this. It ushered Crassus and Pompeius out of office again without a breach. It sent Pompeius into retirement afterwards, there to wait for events which should in due time happen. These were very strange proceedings, without a parallel in Roman politics. Since when had the populares possessed these gifts of diplomacy? Since when, moreover, had they gained the power of playing the intricate chess play which from this point began on the political board? It started from the position in Asia, where Lucullus was carrying on a series of wonderful campaigns against Mithridates. More than any other man, Lucullus was a successor and the representative of Sulla. But he had less political instinct than Sulla, and he was being felt for by a foe more dangerous than any that Sulla ever had to face. Lucullus, who could probably have survived any military difficulties, could not survive the powerful financial influences which were at work against him, both in Asia and at Rome. The Equites were in power again. His last campaigns were wrecked and rendered futile. After exploits which few soldiers have ever surpassed, he began to stand unaccountably in the position of a failure. 3. 2 years after the eventful consulship of Crassus and Pompeius, Gaius Julius Caesar stood as a candidate for the quaestorship, his first official post. His year of office was distinguished by a remarkable episode. His Aunt Julia, the widow of Gaius Marius, died. She was one of the few surviving links which connected that generation with the world of Gaius Gracchus, and although we know nothing of her personality or of the influence which she exercised, Caesar did not seem to think the occasion meaningless. He himself not only delivered the funeral oration, a much admired one in its day, but he did something more significant. He formally exhibited the ancestral images, including that of the outlawed Marius. So popular was this daring action that he could afford to ignore the protests made against it. He was away in Spain the following year, so it would be difficult to bring home to him any responsibility for the progress of the cabal against Lucullus. The logic of events probably saved him much trouble, both then and later. The abolition of Sulla's constitution had been but a preliminary to practical business. The Equites meant to have Lucullus out of Asia. He was superseded and replaced by a fresh commander. Footnote: Publius Claudius Pulcher, the notorious Clodius, afterwards well known as one of Caesar's principal henchmen, was in Asia with Lucullus and actively intriguing against him. The line taken by Clodius does not quite agree with Plutarch's idea that his motive was merely personal resentment against Lucullus. End footnote. Meanwhile, under the government of the oligarchy, the Sicilian corsairs had actually produced famine in Rome itself by intercepting the corn ships, a consummation that can hardly have been altogether unexpected in some quarters. Ways and means were ready. A tribune was put forward to propose a measure of emergency. This, of course, was perfectly in order, but the measure of emergency he proposed was a deep and carefully thought-out scheme which very few tribunes known to us had the brains to produce on their own responsibility. It was that Pompeius should be appointed with full powers, carefully specified, for 3 years to take every necessary step required by the situation. Pompeius was, in fact, made military dictator. The price of corn dropped as soon as the emergency law was passed. The success of Pompeius against the corsairs was swift and complete. In 3 months he did what the oligarchy had not done in 10 years. His treatment of his prisoners was, as usual, humane and sensible. He settled them in colonies in Asia Minor. Caesar, meanwhile, continued his own course with perfect calm, reflecting, it may be, on the admirable example Pompeius had given to the world of the superiority of a single personal ruler to a senate, and reflecting also, probably, on the denseness of the oligarchs whose only method of expressing their political disagreement was to annoy Pompeius. So convinced were the majority of Romans as to the advantages of Pompeius's dictatorship that a new measure was passed, giving him the command against Mithridates. Here, too, the success of Pompeius was a striking illustration of the advantages of a single personal ruler. He took only some 3 years to sweep Mithridates off the board and to carry out a permanent resettlement of Asia. Caesar regarded all these things with approval. The absence of Pompeius gave him, perhaps, additional scope. His aedileship was a rocket flight of brilliance without regard for expense. Footnote: Caesar was in debt 1,300 talents before his quaestorship. The interesting question arises, on what did Caesar spend this immense sum? End footnote. When his own means gave out, he borrowed on a vast scale, which proves that no accommodating loan from friends was in question. Only the great Roman financiers could have produced the money Caesar spent like water. As aedile, he had charge of the public buildings of Rome. One morning, the statues and trophies of Marius stood again on the Capitol, bright with colors and gold, with inscriptions relating the victories of Marius over the Cimbri and Teutones. All Rome rushed to see them. As a test of public opinion and an open declaration of faith, it was successful. We get an interesting glimpse of the change of feeling that was spreading when we read Plutarch's account of the episode. The anger and indignation of some, the tears of joy that arose in others, the instant general identification of Caesar as the only possible person responsible for it, the impeachment of Caesar in the Senate by Catullus, Caesar's cool and satisfactory defense. As well as a test and a declaration, it was a reminder that the policy of military dictatorship, which was showing its value in the successes of Pompeius in the East, was far better represented by the political tradition of Marius. The reminder was one that could be conveyed without words. Other policies and impulses, however, were at work among the populares. There are signs that divisions existed in the secret councils of the party. It had never been intended that Pompeius, on his return home, should continue to be a shining example of either the virtues or the vices of monarchy, but the method of preventing it was not yet clear. The dissensions were indicated by a number of different projects, none of which had the whole weight of the party behind it. There was an attempt, the Servilian Rogation, to set up a commission with supreme power, a board of dictatorship. Caesar himself tried to get a personal commission to settle affairs in Egypt. Neither of these plans succeeded. A third section attempted a revolution, which became famous as the Conspiracy of Catilina. It was betrayed. The very mysterious circumstances of Catilina's conspiracy may be considerably illuminated if we recollect a few cardinal facts. Caesar was both connected with the conspiracy and yet not one of the conspirators. He neither betrayed it nor endorsed it. He endeavored to prevent the illegal execution of Catilina's accomplices. The truth was that they were political allies of his own, of whose policy he disapproved. Footnote: Caesar and Crassus supported the candidature of Catilina for the consulship. In prosecuting the Sullan agents who carried out the proscription, Caesar allowed the escape of the worst of them, Catilina. The only possible explanation is obvious. End footnote. The oligarchy was allowed to suppress the conspiracy on condition that it did not drag in the rest of the party. Caesar probably had good reason for his passivity. The execution of the Catilinarian leaders swept the party clear of an undesirable but powerful element and gave Caesar absolute control. So that from this time onward, we know without question the identity of the anonymous diplomatist who arranged the coalition of Pompeius and Crassus, and we can guess what policy inspired it. The mysterious number one of the populares was Caesar himself. With Caesar in sole control, the party steadied to a perfectly lucid policy. He could depend upon the stupidity of the oligarchy and its readiness to insult and frustrate Pompeius. The return of the latter was imminent. When he arrived, all fell out as had been expected. The Senate refused him the consulship, refused him land for his troops, refused to ratify his reorganization of the East. The populares were aloof until Pompeius was driven to desperation. Then Caesar stepped forward. The coalition was reformed. Pompeius was to receive all that he had asked from the Senate. Through Crassus, the equites were promised a reduction of 1/3 in the purchase money they had contracted to pay for the Asiatic taxes. Caesar was to have the consulship, and afterwards a governorship for 5 years, where perhaps he could recruit his shattered fortunes. The wealthy land of Egypt was not mentioned. The governorship was to be in the comparatively poor and barbarous country of Gaul. This satisfied all the parties to the coalition. We know the result. The agreement was carried out by the disciplined masses of Caesar's voters, the soldiers of Pompeius, and the financial backing of Crassus and his friends. Caesar left for the north, there to begin the creation of the Caesarian army, which was a more splendid military machine than even Sulla's, and that famous conquest of Gaul, which is the start of the history of Western Europe. He kept the organization of the populares firmly in his own hands. Its leaders were his protégés, often men whom he had rescued from ruin. He found 5 years insufficient for the work. The triumvirate was reconstructed. His time of office extended to 10 years. Then came the death of Crassus, the break with the oligarchy, the battle of Pharsalus, the fall of Pompeius, the dictatorship of Caesar, and his assassination at the hands of an oligarchic conspiracy. If Sulla's be a strange and remote age, if Marius be a name to us and little more, the career of Caesar in Gaul and his death are familiar and almost modern history. In going to Gaul, Caesar was following a political tradition. Marius had been praetor in Spain. So was Caesar. Marius had made his military fame in Gaul. So did Caesar. Like Marius, Caesar was a Westerner, a man with faith in Europe, or at any rate with his interests centered upon it. When he crossed the Rubicon, he was leading the young, healthy, rising provinces of the West to the rescue of the old, ruined, and dying Italy. And perhaps he knew it. 4. The assassination of Caesar was a crisis in the most strict and solemn sense of the word. The 2 Gracchi, Saturninus, Glaucia, Drusus, numberless men, great and small, had fallen in the struggle, and the world had, with agitation, pursued its way. But it did not pursue its way after the fall of Caesar. The oligarchy was at length at the judgment seat, and it was condemned to political death. Octavianus and Antonius were the judges, and 500,000 marching, fighting, engineering Roman legionaries were the jury which fought out and returned the verdict. And now, after many years, the movement begun by Tiberius Gracchus reached its goal. He had handed on the tradition to his brilliant and creative brother, who handed it on to the rough, low-born soldier who proved to be the greatest military genius Rome ever produced. And he, in turn, handed it on to the keen, cold, lucid statesman who invented a new type of monarchy to fit the ideal. From him it passed to the first of the Roman emperors, who, on the failures of many men of genius, erected a power destined to be permanent. Augustus had a genius which consisted largely in the absence of all the gifts which men commonly associate with genius. He saw all things in the sober, clear light of perpetual afternoon. All his life he had the qualities of a good chairman of committees. Under the refreshing stream of his mere good sense, the Roman world revived. Other men had laid out and planted that garden. He conducted its maintenance. Its faults and beauties were not of his making. He was not the architect of its grandeur, nor of its baseness. 5. We come now to review and judgment. Rome had passed a political verdict adverse to Sulla. We are bound to ask ourselves the reason and to consider how far it was justified. The first and most obvious reason is, of course, that which has already been given, namely, the worthlessness of the oligarchy and Sulla's failure to find the aristocracy he desired. But this is too vague and general a statement to be particularly useful. Why was the oligarchy worthless? And what was it that really prevented Sulla from reviving aristocracy? On what especial points, if at all, did the methods of Caesar offer better results? The factor which made all the difference was the purest fortune, the character of Caesar. No human contrivance could possibly have secured that he should automatically, and merely by being himself, solve the otherwise insoluble problem of inventing the type of monarchy necessary to justify the policy he inherited from his predecessors. He was almost the last of the great Roman aristocrats. If only one aristocrat were left, and he continued spontaneously, effectively, and without flinching to act as an aristocrat, what would happen? The answer is that he would become a monarch. There is no avoiding this conclusion without altering the meaning of the terms. It was the peculiar virtue of Caesar that he did act throughout in perfect consistence with his own character. His power was not imaginary nor accidental. He really did, by one means or another, dominate all who came into contact with him. He really had the quiet, unbending courage which is never flurried nor frightened. He really had the austere self-mastery which is the infallible index to a man's power of mastering other men. To these qualities, most of which Sulla had possessed in at least equal measure, he really did add the dry lucidity which sees things precisely as they are, and therefore he never hesitated to face the truths which Sulla had elected to ignore. Having to choose between being a chief without a clan and making the world his household, he calmly chose the latter course. As the last of the Roman fathers, he set out to put his giant household in order and to command his multitudinous tribesmen for their good. He was not quite sure what legal form his monarchy would take. Augustus had more to do with the final determination of the details than Gaius Julius, but it was Gaius Julius who rough-hewed the conceptions that were to be embodied in constitutional forms. The ideal of a new type of ruler, neither an oriental despot nor a mere magistrate, but one who could accept the existence of the political state, the res publica, as a necessary part of right human life, and could fulfill the function of regulating it. Once the preliminary difficulty of conceiving a rational monarchy suitable for a political state was overcome, Caesar was faced with the same problem with which Sulla had sought to grapple, namely, the necessity for a real unity of feeling and outlook in those who represented the general direction of the vast Roman state. A genteel aristocracy, whose similarity is to a great degree one of actual common descent, has this unity ready-made from within. The difficulty is, as Sulla found, that once such an aristocracy degenerates or dwindles, it is impossible to recreate it artificially. There is a further difficulty that a genteel aristocracy, being a natural product usually evolved in days prior to the political state, is more or less alien to the institutions of a community rapidly discarding genteel links in favor of contract, agreement, and voluntary nexus. Caesar's solution of the problem was to blend together the hints contained in the policies of his predecessors, the goodwill of Tiberius, with the personal monarchy of Gaius Gracchus, and the military professionalism created by Marius. He removed political control altogether from the oligarchy and from the assembly of the people, vesting it in a body of men distinct from either. The fault inherent in the oligarchic system lay in the fatal method by which it elected men into its own ranks, and the existence of this method was due to its neglect of the qualifications which made for political strength. It could do nothing with men like Sertorius on the one hand, or Spartacus on the other, but exterminate them. But every scoundrel with money could buy his way into its ranks. The policy of Caesar was to make the carrière ouverte au talent through the army. In the army, every Sertorius, every Spartacus had the opening to his natural destiny. The army, therefore, became something between an aristocracy and a bureaucracy. It was not an aristocracy, since it made no attempt to breed the type of man it wanted. It was not a bureaucracy, for it hedged its members with rigid discipline. It was a military order whose chief held in his hands the political control of the Roman dominion. The populares had been transformed from a political party into a military guild. By doing this, Caesar rendered all his ample concessions to the equites absolutely delusive. The political control was now beyond their power to influence. Money would still talk, as it always does, but that leverage which the great bankers had exercised over the provincial governors was rendered impossible. The governors became responsible to the emperor alone. The empire succeeded in asserting the absolute supremacy of the political control over all other forms of dominion. This result would have been impossible had it not been very much to the benefit of the commercial interests themselves. They had sought the great state, and the empire gave it to them. Under the emperors of the 2nd century, Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines, that great state came to the fullest degree of peace, happiness, and prosperity that it had enjoyed. It did not stop nor begin to decline until it had reached the utmost limits that the resources of the age allowed a single government to deal with. Political power ended by outstripping economic power. Not until the age of the steamship, the railroad, and the telephone could a larger political unit be made stable, and the world had to wait until they were invented. 6. But although Caesar was more successful in stamping his ideas upon the world, were those ideas inherently better than Sulla's? Or, on the other hand, were they no more than a substitute to fill the gap left by the failure of better designs? Some of Caesar's policies might not have won their way so readily but for the failure of Sulla's. And in any case, let us remember that Caesar's methods did bring about precisely the results which Sulla tried to prevent. They did close the door finally upon the political evolution of Rome. They did end the era of individuality and liberty. They did remove government from the hands of the civil authorities and hand it over to the soldier. Caesar was justified insofar as he was indeed compelled as a statesman to produce immediate results, but military discipline as a basis for social conduct has this defect about it, that it is produced by external pressure on character. It may usefully mold character, and that is something, but simply to mold character is not enough. Whence is to come the character it molds? A power is necessary which shall literally generate or create action, inspire the being and the deeds of men from within to a common associate end without any external force. This is beyond the power of any statesman. For a man who is using the instruments of ordinary government is to some extent bound by them. He must not look too far ahead, or he may ruin his own power for good. He plays the short game of instant action and prompt results. Another kind of man and another kind of action is required for the long game which reaches far forward and waits for its results, the religious thinker and the institutes of faith. Men do not rest permanently content with discipline alone, because it is not possible to cope with the practical difficulties of life without some freedom of action and range of individual discretion. While they will and do sacrifice a great deal for the sake of material prosperity, they are rightly told by some inward spiritual faculty that freedom is more precious and even ultimately more profitable. All inventiveness, all energy, practically all that makes men materially wealthy, springs from this spiritual freedom, as we can see by the growing paralysis which falls upon them when they lose it. This energy of mind and body is not overrated when we call it holy. The dumb demand of the Roman world was for one more thing, deeper and greater than the gift of immediate organization which Caesar bestowed. 40 years after his death, it came. It was not altogether an accident that the empire and Christianity arrived in the Roman world almost together. They were both of them answers to an insistent problem. They supplied a demand made with all the heart and soul of millions of desperate and miserable human beings, the demand for worldly order and for immortal hope. Nevertheless, this is a criticism as well as an explanation of the facts. Caesar's policy was so inadequate to meet the full demands of the day that a complementary movement was absolutely necessary. And, moreover, that victory of the political principle over the gentile principle, which was marked and illustrated by the success of Caesar, was equally shown in the organization of the new religion. It grew up not as a priestly caste, Levitical or Magian or Brahmin, but as a church, a separate organized body of faithful whose mutual bond was one of agreement and whose members were similarly drawn from every class and race without distinction. Hence, there was from the first a divorce between the two bodies. Christ and Caesar seem to be not merely distinct, but even antagonistic. It takes no great philosophic gift to perceive that this antagonism is a questionable benefit. We have not even yet completely resolved it. We are still haunted by a dualism beyond our power to transcend. The state with its material interests, the church with its spiritual interests, are obviously enough, both of them necessary to human well-being. They are clearly intended to work to a common end. They are parts of some common whole which we do not perfectly grasp. We see the advantages of their separation. It is not easy to dispense with it. It has so often been a benefit to civilization that one should have the power of exerting external influence on the other. Both, at times, are liable to demand an exclusive allegiance. And yet, for all that, we cannot be satisfied with it. The dualism is a radical fault, though we may not be able to see how it could be avoided. We are driven to the belief that somehow, under some circumstances, in some way, these two things may yet be one thing. Human society is not meant to rest permanently satisfied with less. And therefore, Sulla is not to be ignored or despised. He saw many things, some of them things far more remote, more difficult than he supposed them to be. He had defects due to the mental quality of the age he lived in, other defects personal to himself. His vision proved to be out of perspective, but it was not an untrue vision. There were inconsistencies in what he did, cross purposes in the circumstances around him. Some things in his world could not be right because they were posited wrongly to begin with. He looked too much to the past because the social unity there was nearer than the social unity in front of him. But he did hold it better that the determination of policy should rest with the civil power rather than the military, and be discovered by the consensus of men deliberating in common, rather than by the edict of a princeps. He did side with the conception of life in which political, economic, and spiritual authority are united in the same hands. If there is any fault in such a conception, it is not its meanness, but its seemingly impossible idealism. He came of a race of men who had actually wielded such a unity of power, so he did not grant its impossibility, nor are we able to declare, in the light of such a fact, that it is impossible. The truth may be that there are alternations in the process of human history, periods of involution, when all the forces run towards unity, and periods of evolution, when with unanimity they depart from it. They were departing from it in the age of Sulla. The creation of the great state involved the destruction of the old smaller unities, and the building up, often very much on faith, of vaster and much vaguer unities. Authority was becoming dispersed. The old solid faith was becoming broken up by the philosophers. Power was beginning to have its seat outside the old appointed bounds. Sulla fought in vain against the tide which set irresistibly against him, and on which he himself, skeptical, loose-living, unconventional, often drifted. It was impossible to get outside the logic of events by which the Roman aristocracy had leveled up to themselves the successive subject classes. The center of authority and power was inevitably dispersed by the natural development of the process. Hence, an attempt to restore aristocracy was, in a way, an attempt to undo the work of aristocracy. Aristocracy could never, ex hypothesi, be restored until the unity of the great state was impaired, and its component parts had diverged and differentiated, when the process of leveling up would once more become possible. Aristocracy may be defined as a political process of uniting differentiated types. As soon as the union is accomplished, its function automatically ceases. All these considerations suggest that the history of Sulla and his times is a part of a process of which we have not even yet seen the whole. Until we have done so, there can be no final judgment of his work. If this be the case, we must regard it as indissolubly united with our own history, a stage in the development of the life we see about us and live in. However remote he may be or seem, he functions vividly in us. Rome was not on a side path of human evolution, but on the great main highway. We might deduce from all that has here been said that, whether or not Sulla's real aims failed, they were aims by no means doomed to ultimate failure, nor foolishly held. He was right in supposing aristocracy to be important, though he could neither save it nor restore it. He was right because, being an aristocrat himself, he felt its virtues in him. Wrong because he too was grit of the grindstone, part of the logic of events, himself degenerate together with the aristocracy he sprang from. The Roman aristocracy created Rome. After it died out, Rome continued to develop until the impulse given it by the old aristocracy was spent, and then it dissolved. Such is the tale of all civilizations, unless they can renew in some adequate shape the force which originated them. End of Chapter 13. The Death of Sulla's World. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. End of Sulla the Fortunate, the Great Dictator by George Philip Baker.